maybe I'm the accidental researcher. Do what you find interesting and do what you find easy. Ran off across this haulage yard with its 2 testicles hanging out. Maybe we'll have to cut that a bit.
Okay, so here's the first question.
Okay.
Can you please introduce yourself and tell us the milestones of your career?
Okay, my name's Adrian Boswood. I'm a professor of veterinary cardiology at the Royal Veterinary College. I suppose in terms of milestones, I graduated as a vet from Cambridge Vet School in 1989, which now seems a very long time ago. And I spent just over a year in general practice before I joined the Royal Veterinary College, initially as an intern. I did an internship followed by a residency, and the residency was in internal medicine and cardiology. And then I became a lecturer at the Royal Veterinary College. I've sort of gathered a few postgraduate qualifications while I've been going along. So I have what's called the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons Cardiology Diploma, the European College of Veterinary Internal Medicine Cardiology Diploma, and I am now, as I say, Professor of Veterinary Cardiology. So that's kind of a very brief run through.
Okay, so what originally sparked your interest in research and why cardiology specifically?
Yeah, I kind of think of my path to research as being what I might call kind of a circuitous one. It wasn't really a very straight line. And actually, I think a lot of careers don't happen in straight lines. They always look like a straight line in retrospect, but they're not. And actually quite early in my career, I was almost resistant to the idea of doing research. I wanted to become a clinician. And the internship and residency that I did, I was very focused on becoming a clinician rather than a researcher. And a lot of the people that I was working with at the time, who were also doing residencies, kind of got to the end of a residency, and for them, if they were interested in research, their sort of next step was to go on to do a PhD. And I never did that, and so I'm perhaps slightly unusual as I'm a researcher without a PhD. But what then interested me after several years of working in clinical work was the beginning to identify important questions to which there weren't existing answers, and really that to me is the kind of the basis of good clinical research. Is you identify an important question, and then you think of what's the best way to try to answer that question. And of course, usually that means some sort of research. So I sort of almost ended up doing research by accident, because I was looking for answers to clinical questions rather than planning early in my career that I was going to become a researcher. So yeah, maybe I'm the accidental researcher.
So is it kind of like your curiosity that drives you from a clinician to actually doing academic research?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and I think all good research in the end is driven by curiosity. It's driven by the desire to learn more about something that you feel you don't currently understand, and to find out new things. That's always really exciting. So it's kind of curiosity driven, and looking for either answers to questions or different answers to the ones that already exist if you don't tend to agree with the current answer, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I see. And is there any one research project that you're particularly proud of, and why?
I suppose over the last several years, and this is really dating back to before 2005, that there's been a series of clinical trials that I've been involved in, which have all been clinical trials, well, mainly been clinical trials using the drug pimobendan, but using it in different circumstances. And so the sort of first big trial that I was involved in was a study called the Quest study. And then after that, I was involved in a study called the Protect study. And then most recently, the study called the EPIC trial. And I kind of feel that during that progression, I've got better at doing the research. And in the EPIC trial, I also had the privilege of being sort of the lead investigator in the study as well. So, and the other thing about the EPIC trial, which has been very satisfying over the last few years since we published it, is that it's resulted in a very significant change, pretty much worldwide, in the way in which a very common disease is managed. And so what's satisfying about that is to see an almost immediate impact of your research. And the end result of that impact is that there are probably fewer dogs suffering as a consequence of a significant disease, and dogs with that disease are living longer than they previously would have done. So yeah, that's a really nice thing to be able to sort of conclude. So I suppose that the most impactful study, and the one that I think I'm most proud of as a single study, is the EPIC trial. But I can't take credit for that individually, because as with a lot of good research studies, it's something that required the effort of a very large number of people to do it.
So you're doing more like the clinical trial experiments, and do you find it hard to combine the clinical work and the research?
It's hard because the difficulty in academia is that there are sort of multiple things that are effectively competing for your time, and as a clinical academic, there are really four things that compete for time. There is teaching, there's clinical work, there's research, and there's administration as well. And as my career has progressed over the years, I've gone from periods when I was doing, the vast majority of my time was spent doing clinical work. There have been periods where I've been spending more time doing research work, although not the majority of my time. And now actually I find myself in a position where, because I've got quite a lot of administrative responsibility within the veterinary college, I have a fairly fixed but relatively modest amount of time to conduct my research, and actually about 80% of my time is spent doing administrative work and some teaching. So there are always things that conflict for your attention and your time, and it's a question of how you spend it. But going back to kind of the core of your question is does clinical work almost compete with research work, and is it difficult to do the two? Although it's difficult to do the two, I think if you're going to do good clinical research, at least for a period in your career, you need to do both. Because remembering what I said a moment ago as to what sort of brought me into being interested in clinical research, it was the fact that doing clinical work, I was coming across questions to which there weren't pre-existing answers. And so you only really identify the relevant clinical research questions by working in a clinical arena. And if you didn't do the clinical work, if you did purely research, then you might not necessarily recognize what the most relevant questions are.
That is actually a very good point. So, have you experienced any difficulties in your research career? And have you ever thought about quitting?
Well, anyone who tells you that they haven't had difficulties in their research career is a liar. Research is intrinsically difficult, and it's kind of, a lot of the time, it's really about kind of overcoming barriers. If you talk, I don't really do, and never have done, kind of a significant amount of laboratory research, but if you talk to lab researchers, they're always talking about how kind of almost 95% of the time the experiment goes wrong, and 5% of it goes right. And it's about refining your techniques and refining your methods. So I think challenges are intrinsic to research, in that you often you answer good research questions by doing something new. And doing something new, you're always encountering barriers to what it is that you want to do. And you need to learn to persist through those barriers. You actually need to recognize that those barriers are actually part of the learning process in research, in that it's overcoming them that probably makes you a better clinical researcher. And the other thing is that is that kind of classic old saying, which is you learn by your mistakes, is that where things may have gone wrong in the past, that's what makes you design your next study better. So yes, we face difficulties. No doubt, yes, there have been moments when I've thought about giving it up and not doing any more. But fortunately, at the moment, those thoughts have not prevailed, and I've continued to.
It's like a little angel and a little devil, and
exactly,
then the angel.
Exactly, and that's normal. That's kind of normal. That's your little internal dialogue the whole time. That's normal, and encountering those sorts of challenges is fine. Actually, one of the things that's quite interesting about research is when you come up with something that's quite a new idea, or when you come up with something that challenges the sort of the status quo, then people will resist your ideas, and people resist your ideas in different ways. And sometimes they resist them by challenging the quality of the work that you've done, or challenging the underlying basis of the work, or just simply saying that they don't believe you. And there's also an element of research which is about persuasion of people that maybe you are right, and maybe they need to change their mind about certain things, and that's also a kind of an interesting challenge that you have to overcome. You have to accept that you will be opposed in terms of some of your views and some of your findings, and that sort of that professional dialogue, so that's an external dialogue rather than an internal dialogue, is something that is also a necessary part of research. It's
like there's a humane part of the research instead of purely scientific.
Exactly. There's a lovely quote, and I'm trying to remember what it is. I think it was by a philosopher called Schopenhauer. And he said, all truth passes through three phases. He says, first it is ridiculed, secondly it's violently opposed, and then thirdly it's accepted as self-evident truth. And what happens with kind of new ideas in research is that you come up with something and people say, well, that's ridiculous. It's like, why on earth do you think that? So they ridicule your idea. And then as the evidence begins to accumulate that your idea might actually be right, then they begin to violently oppose it. They say, no, I can't possibly believe that. And then eventually, if you may get to the point with some of your findings in your research that actually it's subsequently accepted as self-evident truth, and that everyone then believes it. And there's that, there actually is a recognizable transition in terms of big changes in ideas, that you go through that. First of all, you're ridiculed, secondly, you're opposed, and then thirdly, ultimately, you may be proven to be right, and that happens.
Okay, so what do you say you enjoy the most about research?
Brainstorming with people with kind of shared views, but people who are willing to kind of challenge each other to get the best outcome in a study. So there's anyone who knows me from the point of view of some of the studies that I've been involved in is I love data. I like being involved in the analysis of data, and thinking about potential explanations for findings. And one of the most stimulating environments you can be in is when you're going through new data and new findings with 3 or 4 different people, and you're sort of bouncing ideas off each other. And that's just that's one of the most intellectually stimulating and rewarding things that you can do, which is fantastic. And there's also that element of kind of curiosity, almost to the level of play. It's not quite play, but it's doing good research. You're pursuing your curiosity, and if satisfying your curiosity is something that you find intrinsically enjoyable, then your research should be enjoyable. I mean, admittedly, there's sort of 95% grind and 5% of that actual fun element of it, but it has to be fun.
Of course, otherwise you'll quit.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, here's I personally think it's interesting question. What would you say to someone who would claim that general practice vet doesn't have to care about research?
I think that they have to care about research, but actually I'm going to kind of, that's a really complicated question if you pick through it. And the flip side to that is researchers have to care about primary care practice. And I think there's a danger with some research, and particularly some clinical research, well, not exclusively, but some clinical research, is that it becomes so esoteric and it becomes so specialized that primary care practitioners can't see the relevance of that research to what they do. And so people go off down these little, very narrow, very specialized paths of even clinical research. And primary care practitioners say, well, I'm never going to do anything like that, so it is of no relevance to me. For me, the most rewarding research is the research that can have a direct impact on primary care practitioners, such that they can implement those findings quite quickly after you have generated some research evidence. One way that I think about this, which is not at all meant to be in any way sort of patronizing to primary care practitioners, so I hope it doesn't come over that way, but let's say, for the sake of argument, that 1%, it's probably smaller than that, 0.5% of vets are specialist cardiologists, okay? I'm sure the number is less than that. If I make those 0.5% of vets better at cardiology by developing something that only specialists can do, I actually don't have a very big impact on the care and health of animals, because I only make a very small population of vets better. If I can develop something in terms of clinical research that's either a useful tool or a treatment method that can raise the general standard of practice, so that most animals that present to a practitioner encounter an improved method of diagnosis or an improved method of treatment, then I have the potential to massively raise the standard of care for the majority of animals with that disease. And so I think that it's about a relationship between the research that's done, generating findings that are useful to practitioners, and then the practitioners recognizing that that research is of relevance to them. So it's a two-way thing. In the end, everything that practitioners do, if they're practicing evidence-based medicine, is at some point informed by research findings. And so I think everything practitioners do is relevant to research. They just might have some difficulty immediately seeing what that relevance is.
So you mentioned that doing vet research can improve the health care of animal.
Yeah.
And what's your thoughts on the applicability of vet research to other disciplines?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because it tends to be that veterinary researchers look at what's been done in human health and say, oh, doing what I would call sort of Me Too research, which is that they see a clever thing that's done in people and they say, oh, I can do that too, so I'll do the same clever thing in animals. And so veterinary clinical research often learns from what's already done in humans. What's much less common, but potentially very significant, is if research can do something that goes the other way, which is that something found in veterinary research can ultimately benefit human health. And I don't mean to be overly critical of human medical researchers, but the something that's unique about the veterinary training, which is that because we're trained to deal with multiple species, we are intrinsically comparative in our approach to disease. So, I think about, well, this is a heart disease in horses, this is a heart disease in dogs, this is a heart disease in cats. What are the similarities and what are the differences across several species? And because we naturally think that way, then I think that we can naturally pose research questions that way. There's some fascinating questions. I mean, even if I think within dogs, such a basic question, which is, why do small dogs get valvular heart disease and why do big dogs get dilated cardiomyopathy? That's probably something really fundamental about pathophysiology of disease. And then across species, why do cats get hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and why do dogs get dilated cardiomyopathy? Again, a really fundamental question that probably tells you something about the mammalian myocardium rather than just about dogs and cats. And so I think that there's a really good potential understanding diseases across different species to almost accidentally find something of significant relevance to humans. And I think that's increasingly being recognized. I mean, just as a for instance, if you take the results of the EPIC trial, at the moment, there isn't really a medical preclinical treatment for mitral valve disease in humans. And they just regard it as a surgical disease, which in the vast majority of cases it is for humans. But in that small subsection of human patients who may have inoperable disease for one reason or another, they don't have evidence of effectiveness of different medical treatments. So just possibly, there might actually be a benefit of the findings of the EPIC trial to human patients for an as yet unrecognized benefit of medical therapy in valvular heart disease. So, yeah.
It sounds like the different medical realms should actually collaborate together benefit each other.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a term that's kind of used for that, which is a very broad term, but that kind of the idea of One Health, which is that, that on various different levels, things that affect animals affect humans and vice versa. And then we've also got the influences of things like infectious disease and ecological aspects of disease as well. And that's all wrapped up together in terms of recognizing that and approaching it as kind of disease across multiple species as being that sort of One Health approach, which I think has a lot of potential.
Okay, thank you for that answers.
Okay.
And the next question is, what practical advice would you give to students who want to get into research?
But I'll give you, first of all, my sort of basic career advice. Which is, and some people find it sort of slightly surprising, but then when you think about it, is that do what you find interesting and do what you find easy. The two reasons. One is, do what you find interesting, because if you become successful at it, the chances are you're going to continue to do that for a long time. And so if you end up in a research field that actually isn't really that appealing to you, then you're going to stay in that research field for a long time. I would say, research something that is kind of a meaningful question to you, rather than just doing, say, a research project because it became available and that was the opportunity you were looking for. Then the thing about do it if you find it easy, I think one of the reasons why some people find some things easy is because they're good at it. It might be that you're good at numbers, and so you're going to be good at epidemiology and statistics and those sorts of things, and it probably means that you're sort of predisposed to do well in that field if you already find it easy. So those are two things to kind of think about. Some people think about doing stuff because you find it easy, almost as being taking the easy way out, but actually it's probably because you're good at it when you get beyond a certain point. Then the other thing in terms of advice, I suppose that kind of question sort of presupposes that I knew where I might end up when I started on my career path, and I didn't. I would never have anticipated that I would have got to kind of where I am now. So I don't know that you can necessarily be that clear in terms of your plans from the outset. But if your heart is set on a research career, great. There are some key steps in terms of getting into a research career, which is usually probably doing some sort of postgraduate qualification, be that at master's level or at doctoral level. The one thing that I think that distinguishes good veterinary researchers from other researchers is something that I touched on before, which is that ability to ask and potentially answer clinically relevant questions. And I think sometimes what people don't realize is actually the importance of that clinical experience and the clinical background knowledge. So if you're not yet sure about wanting to do research and that's something that's in your mind, then I would say don't necessarily go straight into it. Spend some time working in practice and getting a feel for what clinical work is like, because there are lots and lots of researchers who have no clinical experience but are very good researchers. And what makes veterinary researchers or veterinary clinical researchers unique is that mixture of research and clinical experience. And that means that can be sort of a distinguishing feature of a veterinary clinical researcher, is that not only can they do research, but they can do clinically relevant research as well. So don't somehow see a career as being like a dichotomy in that you either do clinical work or you do research. I think the two can really help to inform each other. And then if you're thinking of planning a research pathway, then choose your project and choose your supervisor carefully, because that will have a lot of influence on kind of what you do. And don't undersell yourself. I think that there are too few veterinary graduates wanting to go into research. So from a perspective of someone applying for a position, they might think, oh, I really hope I get this position, and be pleased and accept the first offer that they get. But actually, you will be in a position where you're relatively rare and people will be very keen to interest you in a project. And so you can be choosy and not necessarily go for the first opportunity that comes up.
Because I heard of a saying, say, if you want to do research and you go straight into master degree or a PhD degree, actually it's harder for you to actually get into practice because people may not think you're fresh when you're newly graduate. Is that true?
Well, I think that I put it a different way, which is that this analogy may work if you drive. It may not work if you don't drive. So if you say to people who are drivers, Are you a better driver than you were when you passed your driving test? And the answer to that, almost everyone will say yes. And so your driving test is like a threshold level of competence at driving a car. And you train and you train and you train until you're just good enough to reach that level. And then you take the test, and then you drive for a while and you get much better. And a lot of what you do in that period after you've passed your test in terms of improving is just you're kind of training yourself, that things become natural, you don't have to think about it anymore, it's less conscious, and you become really, really competent. And so that first level of clinical competence that you get on graduation is a baseline threshold level. It's good enough for you to be a vet, but you'll get a lot better, and you'll get a lot better quite quickly in the first year or two that you're working in practice. And once you've got that under your belt, once you've got that experience, if you then go away into a research career and come back into practice, it will be much easier to adapt back to practice just because you were that much better when you left. I think if you train for 4 years or 5 years to be a vet, and then you spend 4 years doing a research project not being a vet at all, you will effectively have forgotten most of what you learned, certainly in terms of kind of practical competencies. And it might be better to sort of, if you think it's a possibility that at some point you're going to go back into practice, to reinforce some of those competencies for a year or two before you go off into a research career. So I would say kind of think a little bit carefully about that balance. And if you think at some point in your career you may end up back in practice, then do it for a while first.
That made me think of my mom. She has driving lessons before I was born, and now I'm training her because she hasn't been driving for 20 years, and now I'm training her. Yeah, that's I can relate.
So it shows that if you haven't passed your exams yet, or you've only just passed your exams, you're not actually as good as you will be after you've passed and you've been driving for a while.
Exactly. So you say that you are one of a few researchers without a PhD.
Yeah.
Could you please tell us if you think you were disadvantaged by this, and if you think a PhD is necessary for a good researcher?
That's a really interesting question. I've often thought to myself that has it potentially been more difficult to convince people that I'm a credible researcher without a PhD? I think probably my career path would certainly have been different. Whether it potentially would have been easier or not, I don't know. Really interesting thing is that several of my contemporaries who did residencies and then went on and did PhDs, or who tried to do PhDs at the same time as doing their residency, ended up not doing research. And I think in some of their cases, maybe it switched them off doing research. They didn't enjoy doing research, or it took them away from what most interested them at that point in their career. And so it's one of those sort of unanswerable questions. It's like, would the present be different if the past had been different? Definitely. And what I don't know is in what way it would have been different. And one of the things that I find is that, and this is kind of an observation about things in general rather than necessarily specific things, is that sometimes if you come at things from a slightly unconventional angle and you think about things slightly differently, you come up with different solutions to other people. So it may have made certain aspects of my career a little bit more difficult. It may still make some of them difficult to this day, but it's not really something where I kind of look back and think, oh, that was a mistake. I really wish I'd done a PhD. I'm kind of pretty happy with where I ended up. So in terms of the research that I've done, and but yeah, no, really interesting question. I think there is a greater breadth of PhDs available now than was available in the early 90s, when I was at the point in my career where effectively it was a choice that I could make. And because of that, I think there's now greater potential for people to do more clinically focused research projects. So I think it's probably easier to do a project now that would enable you to maintain your clinical interest at the same time as do a PhD. I certainly wouldn't advise against doing a PhD, and that's probably a more straightforward path if you know that you're interested in doing research in the longer term. Does that mean that only people with PhDs can do research? No, it doesn't. It doesn't mean that at all. And I don't think we should, for instance, diminish the capacity of people, for instance, in primary care practice to do research in the right setting. So I don't think only people with PhDs should be regarded as researchers, but I do think that if you're thinking of becoming a researcher, and that's likely to be a primary focus of your career, probably the most straightforward way to do that would be to do a PhD.
Like PhD is more like people who are actually like confirmed they actually want to do research for the rest of their life, for instance, like very.
Yeah, a lot of the time, yeah. I mean, a PhD is a specific research training, and it's a way of probably compressing into 3 years things that it took me a lot longer than 3 years to learn. So you know, you may end up in the same place, you know, with a similar capacity to undertake research, but you come at it in a different way. You know, the way I look at it is that having done a PhD, it would have excluded me from certain things that I did and was able to achieve earlier in my career in terms of clinical specialism, for instance. And I think it's about getting that balance right.
Time management is the key.
Sometimes those things are kind of seen in conflict, but I don't think they should be. And if you look at the requirements, the overall kind of body in Europe that regulates clinical specialism is called the European Board of Veterinary Specialization. And in order to gain specialist status, you need to have at least 2 publications, and one of those publications needs to be, I think, a first author publication that's more than just, for instance, a retrospective case series or something like that. So there's an expectation that people who are becoming specialists will engage to some extent in clinical research. And I think that's entirely justified, because it's about more than just the technical competencies of becoming a good specialist. It's about thinking in that way, which is, how can I approach this novel question, or how can I try to answer this new thing, is part of what a specialist should be able to do. It should be able to approach a novel problem in a novel way. And also, if you look at maintenance of specialist status, so clinical specialty colleges, certainly within Europe, you have to demonstrate engagement in your discipline in order to then be what's called reaccredited every 5 years. And part of what goes into that reaccreditation is evidence of research output in terms of kind of publications and speaking at conferences and those sorts of things. So there's an active encouragement that people who wish to become specialists should spend at least some of their training doing clinical research, because I think, as we were saying earlier in that question about is research relevant to practice, I think research is particularly relevant to specialist practice, not exclusively, but particularly relevant to specialist practice. And to be at the forefront of your specialist practice, you need to understand how research works.
Okay, this brings me to the last question, the chill one. If there is one, can you please share the funniest story in your career?
Let me think. I'm not sure if this is kind of a research-related story. There are lots of funny things.
It's fine. It don't need to be related to research. Just a funny thing.
Well, there was one study that there was one thing that I shared relatively recently, actually, with our. In fact, was it at your? Oh no, it was for the year above you that were on their last day of lectures that I shared this piece of information. So I'll share it for you as well. And I'm conscious that this may end up on YouTube. But when I was in practice, I was working in Essex, and where I was born and grew up. So it was an area I knew well. And there was the practice that I was in was about 80% small animal, but it had a few horses and a few cows. So there was it was back when there was still the odd dairy farm and a bit of beef in Essex. And I got called out to castrate a beef bull. But basically what had been happening was, and I think this is the case, that there was a haulage yard where lorry drivers drove and parked up their lorries, and it was on an old farm, and presumably to have it still classified as a farm, they had to keep some animals on the farm. And so they had a few Charolais beef cows, and they kept their calves, and they decided to castrate these calves quite late. And so basically I was castrating a pretty much entire male full-grown bull. And we got it to walk into this crush, and it walked into the crush, and I put in some local anaesthetic, and went to make my incisions to exteriorize the cow's or the bull's testicles, and made one incision, pulled out one testicle, made another incision, pulled out the other testicle, at which point the bull decided it didn't like it. And it sort of shook itself, stood up, broke the crush, and ran off across this haulage yard with its two testicles hanging out, hemorrhaging all over the haulage yard. And I have this sort of memory of recognizing what my professional obligations were in the circumstance, which is kind of keep people safe and animal welfare and all these things. And I just have a picture of a bull running away from me with two testicles hanging out, bleeding all over the place. Anyway, most of the people who were there were not experienced animal handlers. They were lorry drivers. And well, we just got this group of lorry drivers to try to round up this bull and get it back into the sort of the chase, and we sort of rapidly reconstructed the crush to get this bull into it, which we did in the end, and I managed to get its testicles off and everything was all right. But that was one of the more entertaining parts of my career, was seeing a bull running away with its testicles hanging out. But there we are. Maybe we'll have to cut that a bit.
Maybe this bit is violating animal welfare.
Well, it all worked out okay in the end. So
yeah. That is funny. Okay, I think that's all for all of our questions.
Okay.
I really thank you for coming. I really enjoyed the interview, and it's really a pleasure to have you as our first interview.
Thank you. I feel privileged to be your first interviewer. I hope that your remaining interviews go well too.